She never planned to come back to that town, not after everything that had happened there, not after leaving behind memories she believed time had softened. But the moment she stepped off the train and felt the cold morning air touch her face, she understood how wrong she had been. Because some places do not let you go so easily. They wait for you patiently, carrying every unspoken word and unfinished feeling. And as she stood on the quiet platform, watching people pass with their ordinary lives and ordinary destinations, her thoughts kept drifting to him, to the man whose name she hadn't spoken out loud in years, but whose presence had never truly left her heart. And with every step she took toward the exit, memories returned uninvited, reminding her of shared laughter, late-night conversations, promises whispered as if they were secrets too fragile to survive daylight. And it was there, in that moment of hesitation between past and present, that she felt it, the unmistakable sense that coming back was not a coincidence, but the beginning of something she had been running from for far too long. She kept walking even when her feet slowed down, as if her body remembered the town better than her mind allowed. And with every step the past pressed closer, filling the silence with moments she had tried to forget, because this place had once been the center of her world, the place where love had felt simple and endless, where every day carried the promise of a future she believed was unbreakable. And as she passed familiar buildings and faded shop signs, she realized how deeply those years had shaped her, how much of herself she had left behind when she chose to leave, believing distance would erase what time could not. Yet standing there now, surrounded by echoes of shared laughter and unspoken goodbyes, she understood that love does not vanish just because it is abandoned. It waits quietly, growing heavier with every year it remains unresolved. And for the first time since her return, she admitted to herself that coming back was not about closure, but about facing a truth she had never been brave enough to confront. She did not expect to see him that day, and yet something inside her had been quietly preparing for it ever since she stepped back into town, because certain encounters are not accidents but conclusions waiting to happen. And as she stood inside the small, dimly lit bookstore near the station, running her fingers slowly along the worn spines of novels she once loved, she felt a strange tightening in her chest, the kind that arrives before your mind understands why. And when she finally lifted her eyes and saw him standing only a few steps away, frozen in the same disbelief, the world around them seemed to dull, as if sound and movement had politely stepped aside to give space to a moment neither of them was ready for. And she noticed everything at once, the subtle lines on his face, the familiar seriousness in his eyes, the way he held himself as if life had taught him caution. And she realized with a quiet ache that time had changed him just enough to make his presence feel both familiar and painfully distant. And as they stared at each other without speaking, memories flooded back uninvited, reminding her of laughter shared in this very place, of arguments whispered between shelves, of promises once made with certainty and later broken with silence. And standing there, surrounded by stories that had survived decades of being read and reread, she wondered whether their own story had truly ended, or whether it had simply been paused, waiting for the courage they had locked before. Neither of them spoke at first, because some moments demand silence more than words, and as the space between them filled with everything they had never said, she felt the weight of years pressing gently against her chest, reminding her how easily love can survive distance yet struggle with timing. And when he finally broke the quiet by saying her name, softly, almost carefully, the sound of it stirred something deep within her, something she had protected for a long time. And as they exchanged awkward smiles and cautious questions about life, work, and the years they had spent apart, she realized how much effort it took to keep the conversation on safe ground, because beneath every polite sentence lived memories of nights spent talking until sunrise, of dreams they once planned together, and of the moment everything had fallen apart without a clear ending. And as they stood there, surrounded by books that told stories of second chances and irreversible choices, she felt the unmistakable pull of emotions she was not sure she was ready to face, knowing that this unexpected meeting was not reopening the past, but forcing it into the present where it could no longer be ignored. They decided to walk together, not because either of them suggested it out loud, but because separating again so soon felt dishonest, as if fate had gone through too much effort to bring them into the same space only to let them retreat immediately. And as they stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, she became acutely aware of how close he was, close enough that she could sense his presence without looking at him, close enough to remember how natural it once felt to walk beside him in silence. And with every slow step down the familiar street, memories rose and fell between them, shaping the pauses in their conversation, the careful choice of words, and the unspoken awareness that this walk was not casual, but symbolic. A quiet acknowledgement that whatever they had left unfinished years ago still existed, unresolved and waiting. And as the sky began to soften into evening colors, she wondered whether this unexpected reunion would finally bring clarity, or if it would complicate everything she had worked so hard to move beyond. As they continued walking, the town seemed to slow down around them, as if giving space to a conversation that had waited far too long to happen, and she noticed how his presence still affected her, how every glance and every quiet breath stirred feelings she believed had settled into memory. Yet, as they spoke about the lives they had built apart, she sensed the careful distance in his words, the way he avoided certain topics while lingering on others, and it became clear that neither of them had truly escaped the past. They had simply learned how to carry it quietly. And when he admitted that leaving her had been the hardest decision he had ever made, she felt a sharp mixture of relief and pain, because hearing that truth did not heal the wound, it only reminded her how deep it had once been. And as the evening air grew cooler and the streetlights began to glow, she realized that this walk was not leading them forward or backward, but deeper into emotions they could no longer pretend were harmless. They eventually stopped near the river, the same quiet place where they once spent countless evenings talking about dreams that felt endless back then. And as the water moved slowly beneath the fading light, she felt the weight of the moment settle heavily inside her, because standing there beside him made it impossible to pretend that time had erased what they once were. And when he leaned against the railing and looked out across the river instead of at her, she understood that he was struggling too, choosing distance as a way to protect himself from emotions he no longer trusted. And as the silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sound of water and distant city noise, she realized how much courage it took to remain standing there instead of walking away. Because this reunion was reopening wounds that had healed unevenly, scars formed from misunderstandings, missed chances, and a love that had ended without true closure. And when she finally spoke, admitting that she had never fully moved on despite building a life that looked complete from the outside, the confession felt both terrifying and relieving. And in his quiet response, she heard regret, longing, and restraint woven together, reminding her that love does not disappear simply because it becomes complicated. It lingers, waiting for honesty, even when honesty risks changing everything. The conversation slowly shifted from memories to truths they had avoided for years, and as the evening deepened around them, she felt a strange mix of vulnerability and strength, because speaking honestly no longer felt like weakness, but like necessity. And when he admitted that fear had guided many of his choices, fear of commitment, fear of disappointment, fear of not being enough for the future they once imagined, she recognized those same fears within herself, mirrored back through his words. And standing there beneath the soft glow of the streetlights, she realized how often love fails, not because it lacks depth, but because people lack the courage to stay present when things become uncertain. And as he looked at her then, not with expectation, but with quiet sincerity. She understood that this moment was not about rewriting the past, but about deciding whether they were brave enough to face what still existed between them, knowing full well that whatever came next would change them both in ways they could no longer predict. They decided to sit on a nearby bench, not because the conversation was finished, but because both of them felt the weight of everything they were carrying. And as they settled into the quiet space between spoken truths and unspoken emotions, she found herself studying him more carefully than before, noticing how his gestures had slowed, how his voice carried a caution that hadn't existed years ago. And it struck her that time had shaped them both through loss, compromise, and choices made without certainty. And when he spoke about the life he had built after she left, describing relationships that never fully lasted and ambitions that never completely satisfied him, she listened with a strange calm, realizing that his story was not meant to make her jealous or regretful, but honest. And as she shared her own journey, the moments of independence, the nights of loneliness, and the quiet resilience she had learned to cultivate, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Not physically, but emotionally, until she felt exposed in a way that was both frightening and liberating. And in that shared vulnerability, she understood that love does not return as it once was. It returns transformed, demanding maturity, accountability, and a willingness to accept that the future will never be as simple as the past. As the night settled fully around them, the air growing cooler and heavier with unspoken possibilities, she felt a quiet shift inside herself, the kind that happens when hesitation slowly gives way to intention. And as they stood up from the bench and began walking again, she realized how different this moment felt compared to the past, because there was no urgency to impress, no illusion of perfection, only two people finally willing to acknowledge what time had revealed about them. And when he asked her, carefully and without pressure, whether she believed people could find their way back to each other after everything had been broken and reshaped, the question lingered between them like a fragile offering. And as she considered her answer, she understood that love was no longer about certainty or promises, but about choosing honesty over fear. And standing there beneath the quiet glow of the streetlights, she felt something steady and unfamiliar settle in her chest, the realization that whatever path they chose next, it would be taken with open eyes, aware of the risks, yet guided by the truth they had finally allowed themselves to speak. They eventually reached the edge of the old park, where the noise of the town softened into distant echoes. And as they walked beneath the tall trees that had once been silent witnesses to their younger selves, she felt an unexpected calm settle over her, because this time there was no pressure to decide everything at once, no demand for immediate answers, only the quiet understanding that reconnection did not require haste. And when he admitted that seeing her again had forced him to confront the parts of himself he had avoided for years, the fears, the regrets, and the mistakes that had shaped his distance, she listened without judgment, realizing that forgiveness did not mean forgetting, but allowing space for growth. And as they slowed their steps, sharing small smiles and thoughtful silences, she understood that this night was not about reclaiming what was lost, but about discovering whether something new could grow from the truth they were finally brave enough to share. They found themselves sitting on one of the old wooden benches beneath the trees, the kind that carried the quiet history of countless conversations, confessions, and goodbyes. And as the night air wrapped around them, she felt the weight of everything they had avoided for years pressing gently but insistently against her thoughts, because being this close to him again made it impossible to hide behind the version of herself she had carefully constructed after leaving. And when he spoke about the loneliness that followed their separation, not dramatic or loud, but slow and persistent, the kind that settles into everyday life, she recognized that same loneliness within herself, mirrored in different choices and different cities. And as they shared these truths without interruption or defense, she realized how rarely people allow themselves to be fully seen, flaws and regrets included. And sitting there beside him, listening to his voice soften with honesty, she understood that love does not always return as desire or certainty. Sometimes it returns as understanding, as patience, and as the quiet willingness to sit with someone in the discomfort of what once broke you. And in that moment, she felt something shift, not toward the past they lost, but toward a future that would demand more courage than either of them had shown before. When they finally stood up to leave the park, neither of them hurried, as if both instinctively understood that this night was not meant to be rushed or simplified. And as they walked slowly toward the quiet streets beyond the trees, she felt a steady awareness growing inside her. The realization that reconnecting did not mean erasing the pain they had caused each other, but choosing to face it without pretending it never existed. And when he admitted that he had often imagined this exact moment, rehearsing conversations he never had the courage to start, she felt a surprising tenderness rather than resentment, because hearing his honesty stripped the past of its sharpest edges. And as they shared small details about their lives now, the habits they had formed, the ways they had changed, she noticed how much more grounded he seemed, less driven by fear and more by reflection. And walking beside him under the dim streetlights, she understood that love, when given a second chance, does not return as innocence, it returns as intention, asking for patience, responsibility, and the willingness to build something real rather than ideal.